welcome to this week's episode of the Goodrum Show with me, Chris Goodrum. As per usual, a big thank you to everybody that watched last week's episode of the show, liked, commented, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, very, very much appreciated. Always fun to do an archive episode of the show, have a dig around in some boxes and see what I can find. But today we're sort of doing something a little bit more up to date. So it's featuring, as you can see from the title page, 3 new releases from Mossburn Distillers in their vintage cask range, along with 3 bottles from, well, I say recent release, actually last year's Cask Noir releases from Brave New Spirits. So big thank you to both independent bottling companies for the samples for today's episode of the show. Hopefully I won't disappoint you with my my review of said bottling. So as there's not really a great deal to say, let's just take a look at today's lineup. Right, okay, so we're going to kick off with a couple of grain whiskies. As you well know, and I am quite a big fan of grain. These 2 are, should we say, bottled on the cusp of being sort of really ready for bottling in an age statement terms. I mean, I've always held the personal opinion that you really shouldn't be bottling a grain whisky for at least 15, ideally more years, because they just are too neutral prior to that time. Anyway, so like I said, these are both on the cusp of that sort of age. So the first one is in the Mossburn Vintage Cask series, number 37, North British 15-year-old, batch number 18.1108.37, a selection of Oloroso Hoggies, and distilled in 2008, bottled March of this year at 58.8%. Nothing like starting with a nice light one, is there? And on to the second bottling. This is the Brave New Spirits Cask Noir Ghost of the Hill. Now, as you know, they have not code, I suppose, that they like to sort of like give their Cask Noir bottlings and the other range, which memory kind of the superhero range, kind of names. So Ghost of the Hill, and the names sort of have a tie-in with the distillery. I would imagine that the reason they've called this Ghost on the Hill is because obviously Port Dundas was closed back in 2009, I think it was. So this was distilled in March of 2006, so well before Diageo decided to bring the shutters down, so to speak. It was bottled in April of 2023, a single cask, a first fill Lafitte wine barrique. Don't know whether that's a finish or whether it spent its entire life in said barrique. So bottled at 54.6%, and like I said, 17 years old, so right on the cusp of being about ready, as I say. Then we're going to move on to the malts. So the first one again is in the Brave New Spirits Cask Noir range. It's called Ivy in Tennessee. It's a Blair Athol. Now the reason they call it anything to do with Blair Athol Ivy, I believe, is to do with the fact that the distillery is covered in ivy, I think. And obviously in Tennessee would imply aged in a first fill American oak hoggy, which indeed it actually is. So distilled in April of 2011, bottled in March of 2023 at 56.7%. Then we're going to do the final of the 3 Brave New Spirits bottling. So this is Craigellachie, Telfords Travels in the Rhone Valley. Not entirely sure what the Telford bit is, but maybe it was one of the early owners of Craigellachie, possibly. So this is so the Travels in the Rhone. That kind of gives away again the cask aging or finishing, possibly. First fill Côte de Rhone cask. It was distilled in October of 2014, bottled in March of 2023, making it 8 years old at 55.1%. Then we're going to move on to another Craigellachie. Ooh, joy of joys. So this is the Mossburn Distillers number 38. It's a 16-year-old, batch number 12.1207.38. Love their batch numbers. They really sort of slip off the tongue, don't they? So this is a selection of Craigellachie aged in Masala casks, distilled in 2007, bottled in March of this year at 52.4%. And yes, I know I've still not got round to getting a 6th glass. Just keep forgetting. Final of the Mossburn samples for today's episode of the show is number 36. This is a 12-year-old Inchgower, batch number 25.0411.36, distilled in 2011, bottled in March of this year at 57.1%, and a selection of Sauternes casks. So no peat to finish with, but well, I was about to say a big whack of Sauternes, but I might be giving the game away a little bit. Anyway, I didn't say that. Right, anyway, so yeah, like I said, not finishing on any peat, which is a bit unfortunate, but you know, you can't have everything, can you? So let's kick off with a bit of North British then. Okay, so 15-year-old North British. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Quite mentholated Oloroso, coffee, licorice, raisinated fruits. There's a bit of grainy fruit underneath there, a bit of grainy dried fruit. Now the thing about sort of grain whisky is it's not particularly complex, we all know that, but it has a certain sort of nippiness, graininess, I tend to use the term, and it does work quite well with Oloroso, because although the Oloroso is the main point of this nose, shall we say, or the main focus of the nose, the grain is still there, it nips through, it's got that sort of edge to it, which allows it to sort of cut through the Oloroso. A little bit of citrus possibly coming out now, a little bit of sort of oak toast possibly. Yeah, it's a pleasant nose. Let's see what the pass on. Again, very much like the nose, so it's lots of Oloroso, sort of raisinated dried fruits. That's, you can taste that's 58%. That's really quite masked, but it kind of almost stops the sweetness of the Oloroso and all that raisinated fruits, and then you get the sort of like the dried fruit of the grain character coming through on the finish. A little bit of a nippiness, a little bit of spice, some toasted oak as well to start with. Now, I mean, it's like I said, it's not the most complex of whiskies, and you know, unless your grain whisky is sort of like 30 or 40 years old, it's not a surprise. But it delivers what it does quite pleasantly. It's a bit more fuller, it's a bit more sherry, there's a little less of the sort of the nippiness from the grain now that the alcohol has been toned down a bit. There's still some dried fruit. It's pleasant, it's okay. See what the pass like. The palate is a little bit simpler, but again, it kind of pretty much progresses in the same manner as it did neat, although it's not quite so masked, and the sort of the Oloroso drops off as the grain kind of comes through on the finish. It's, like I say, it's pleasant. A lot of it with grain whiskies really does tend to sort of come down to the pricing, and I must admit I didn't check on the price of this, but I wouldn't have thought it's going to be ridiculously expensive. So yeah, not a bad start. Okay, so let's move on to the second of the two grain whiskies. This is the Ghost on the Hill, the Port Dundas. Let's see what the nose gives on this end, shall we? Quite treacly in actual fact. Autumnal baked red fruits, apple, a little bit of raisinated fruit, a little bit of fig, some sultana. Again, the sort of like the grain comes through with a little bit of a nip, a little bit of desiccated coconut. Again, it's not hugely complex. Again, it's more about the cask than it is about anything else. But again, you can get the grain coming through. I get the feeling that when you sort of like put a little drop of water with this, it's going to kind of unleash all the sweetness, because the sweetness of that red winey fruit is kind of feels like it's being contained by the alcohol. I could be wrong here, but you know, it's again, it's not an unpleasant nose. Let's sort the pass on. Again, that's quite masked. I mean, that's 4% less than the previous one, but it tastes like it's 4% more. It really does. That's really quite a mouth-watering finish. Right, so it kind of kicks off again with the sort of quite creamy oak. In actual fact, I get sort of creamed coconut. Then we're moving into red fruits, dried red fruits, a little bit of spice. I don't really get a lot of dried fruit grain character. It's more nippy alcohol, and sort of that, and in turn is intensifying the spices. It's a little bittering on the finish, and there's not a great deal of it because basically the alcohol is pretty much slamming the brakes on that. So let's put a little drop of water with it and see what that does. Okay, it's pretty much the same as it was without any water. A little softer maybe. It's not quite as spicy. It's a little more woodier possibly, but not spicy, if you see what I mean. Maybe there's a touch more grain coming through as well, a little bit more grainy dried fruit. Let's see what the parts are. It's a better balance. It's a little bit sweeter, but it's not winey sweet. There's some sweet dried fruits from the grain. It really is quite bitter still on the finish, and there's an almost kind of, it's not quite sulphur note, but it's almost there. It's okay length, it's fine. There's a bit of tannin there, there's a bit of sort of a bit of winey red fruit, but it's become a little bit sort of, you know, and it boils down to the sort of like the fact that the grain itself isn't inherently complex, and like I said, with a lot of grain whiskies, that they rely on oxidation, they rely on sort of being aged for a considerable length of time to give them that kind of level of complexity. Sometimes the developing rumminess, or sometimes cognac-esque kind of dried fruits kind of goes hand in hand with it. But when they're quite young, and I, although it's 17 years old, in grain terms I class that as pretty young, it still hasn't really developed enough kind of character. But on the other side of the coin, it's not a bad whiskey at all. Again, it will all kind of boil down to sort of what the retail price for that is. And again, I wouldn't have thought it was a ridiculous price. So, you know, yeah. Right, okay, so on to a bit of Ivy in Tennessee. Let's see what the nose gives us on this then, shall we? Big, chunky, vanilla, big American oak, quite barleyed. There's sort of almost kind of perfumed white flower note coming through, some terse kind of almost astringent green fruit, that classic sort of space-eyed gooseberry, green apple, a little bit of candy floss. It's got this kind of sweet sourness going on. It's an interesting nose, I will give you that. it's certainly the spirit is not overpowered with it, and that's the thing about Blair Athol. It has the weight, it has the sort of like the cones, shall we say, to deal with oak quite well, and it is coping with us quite well. So on that plus side, plenty of distillery character, plenty of oak. It's a little bit astringent, like I said, but it's not too astringent. I've had a lot more astringent Speysides than this. Let's see what pass on. Taste the alcohol on that one as well. Not much of a finish there. So yes, big, chunky, chewy, malty, lots of American oak, lots of vanilla. There's an edginess to the spirit, an edginess to the barley. It's not sort of, it's not all sort of soft and full and that. That sort of edginess is tied up in the astringent Speyside green fruits and things, and it kind of, I suppose to a sense, works because it kind of battles against the sort of like the big, creamy and chunky American oak. And it eventually wins out. Certainly, although the finish is quite master, Speyside character just keeps going and going, and you get lots of green fruit. So, technically, from a very technical point of view, this whiskey works really, really well. Am I really warming to it? It's just a little bit sort of astringent. I think it's one of those sort of whiskies that you have to find a time and a place for, to a certain extent. It's not a sort of like, you know, yeah, I don't really want to think about what I'm drinking kind of whiskey, because it's sort of, it's not that kind of whiskey. Anyway, let's see what the nose gives us with a little drop of water. Okay, so it's knocked back the oak somewhat. It's a little bit more floral now, softer spirit, not quite so astringent, more richer, more honeyed, more Blair Athol, as I would expect Blair Athol to be, if you see what I mean. Yeah, that's a nice nose now. I've kind of tamed it a little bit, I think. Let's see what the palate's like. Again, tame the alcohol, tame the intensity of the green Speyside fruits. Yes, all right, it makes it a little simpler, I will say that, but for me, it makes it a lot more drinkable. It's a lot softer, it's more rounder, it's not quite so astringent. There is still a bitterness from the oak, there is still an astringency there, don't get me wrong on that, but it's now slightly more contained and slightly better balanced, in my personal opinion. And this is one of the wonderful things with cask strength whiskies. Sometimes they work so well without water, you get that kind of almost natural kind of raw, intensive character, and sometimes that just needs to be tamed a little bit, you know. And so by bottling it at cask strength, you can just do whatever you like with it. You can dilute it to your heart's content, just to find that right point. And sometimes it takes quite a while, in actual fact, to find that kind of right point. But I think I found it quite nicely here. So yeah, not a bad whiskey. Okay, so let's move on to the 8-year-old Craigellachie. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? I don't get a lot of spirit character here, I suppose, which I would argue is probably not such a bad thing with Craigellachie. It's so bloody variable. I mean, the distillery itself is kind of, what's the polite term? Produces that characterful spirit. So, you know, not a huge amount of copper contact, worm tubs, all that kind of stuff. Meaty, sulphurous new make. Which needs some time to sort of mellow out to a sort of a honeyed richness. And to be honest with you, I mean, the few times I've tasted the distillery releases, they have indeed been pretty much as you would expect, that sort of style of whiskey. The trouble is, of course, that the independents are so variable. You do get some good ones, Craigellachie's, but then you get some really rough ones, it has to be said. And maybe that's the thing, isn't it? Maybe you play around with worm tubs and all that. Maybe you are going to get a bit of a few rough casks coming out before the sort of spirit kind of like, you know, magically cleans itself up. But anyway, yeah, this is very much about the wine cask. It's like sweet, sweet dried fruits, dried red fruits, spice, syrup. Get quite a bit of syrup. It's pretty much, like I said, it's very much cask, and not an awful lot of Craigellachie, it has to be said. So how's that? Chewy, again, pretty much all cask orientated, red fruits, syrup. I will say that the alcohol, although where are we, 55.1%, really well integrated. I'm not getting an alcohol burn, I'm not getting that kind of mouth-watering maskingness, a little bit of a mouth-watering sort of bit on the finish, but I'm not getting any real distillery character, I'm not getting any spirit character. It's pretty much all about the cask. Let's see if a little drop of water kind of just knocks the cask back a little bit. There's always a bit of a danger, I suppose, even though it is 55%, it doesn't really taste like it, that it's all going to go a bit pear-shaped possibly, but no, not a great deal of change. It's still very much cask orientated. It hasn't really changed that. I'm getting no real sort of, maybe there's a little bit of an intimation of barley possibly, but yeah, I'm not getting a great deal other than the Côte de Rhone cask. Let's see what pass on now. Likewise the palate. No real change there. In actual fact, it's almost kind of like sort of, well, can't really emphasise the Côte de Rhone cask because it just kind of tastes of that anyway. It's quite short. It's kind of sort of kicked the sort of finish into the long grass to a certain extent, and it's a bit kind of, cask, wine, finish, no, yeah. It's okay. I mean, it's not a bad whiskey. It's another one of those kind of whiskies that sort of, it's not sort of like, giving me a tingling in the nether regions, shall we say. And it's not a whiskey I'm getting particularly excited about. It's well made. There's no faults there per se, but it's just sort of like, pretty much all about the cask, and to me that does make it makes it unbalanced at the end of the day. Whether or not you kind of like the character of the distillery, I suppose in the end of the day is kind of slightly immaterial because you can't taste any of it. So for me, I would reject it on that ground, but I wouldn't reject it because of the quality, if you see what I mean. Right, more Craigellachie. So this is the 16-year-old Masala cask. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Right, now I am getting Craigellachie character here. I'm getting kind of industrial barley. It's got a little bit of a rawness. It's got that sort of perfumed, aromatic, masala-y, sort of biscuity kind of dried fruit characteristic, a bit of white licorice. Technically, better balanced. I mean, I am getting distillery character here. Not that it's a distillery character that it's really kind of like, again, tingling in the nether regions, I'm afraid. But from a technical perspective, you've got to say this really works quite well. You're getting cask character, you're getting distillery character. Now, there's some of you that love this kind of stuff. There's some of you people that love kind of, Deanston, for argument's sake. So those of you that love Deanston would be in heaven with this, even though it's not quite so industrial as Deanston. Let's see what it passes like. That's quite meaty in actual fact, quite full, quite, you know, it's kind of, yeah, you can see those worm tubs in operation. They're really giving it that some kind of meatiness, beefiness. The masala is adding that sort of dried grapiness to it. It's maybe not quite so industrial on the palate. There is a sort of an edge there, I will give it that. Yeah, I can get that to a certain extent. I think, I remember when I initially tasted it, I was not in kind of like, you know, heaven with it. I don't think I still am, but I'm not kind of quite so anti it. It's not particularly complex at the end of the day, but it's kind of, it's, I suppose, a little bit more indicative of the characteristics of Craigellachie, as you would expect. There's a little bit of sort of that Madeira-y kind of biscuitiness on the finish. So again, from a technical point of view, you can't argue with it. I mean, you know, the Mossburn guys have put together a really good whiskey. Whether you like it or not, of course, is you know, that's secondary, I suppose. Well, to a certain extent. Okay, it's a little bit more floral now. It's a little bit more honey coming out. But there's a soapiness there as well, which is a slight unfortunate angle here. Yeah, and that soapiness is increasing, and it's kind of irritating the hell out of me, it has to be said. And that's the problem when you start to pick up on, and it's not a fault. I mean, it's just the way the spirit is just has gone, you know. And sometimes that soapiness just will never ever go away. Sometimes it will go with time, but sometimes it will just never leave. And it's, again, there's a meatiness there. There's a, you know, it's kind of, it's Craigellachie. It's kind of idiosyncratic. It's just what it is at the end of the day. Let's see what that's like. Again, you know, still quite full, quite rich, quite meaty. More masala now on the palate now. Put a little drop of water with it. More biscuitiness, more grapiness. It's pleasant. It's okay. It's still not a sort of like a lovely kind of soft, seductive kind of whiskey. It's still living in the industrial end of the spectrum, but the masala, when you put a little drop of water with it, has kind of softened it a little bit. Yeah, it's a question of, you know, whether that's really your kind of thing or not. But like I said, from a technical perspective, you can't argue that is a bloody good whiskey. From a drinkability angle, it all depends on your sensibilities and whether you have a sort of a delicate palate. Okay, so moving on to the final whiskey of the afternoon. This is the Inchgower 12-year-old matured in Sauternes cask. Now, I'm just going to stick my nose in the glass and see what happens. That's pretty dense. Dense, floral, honeyed, white fruit, marmalade, floral, white fruit notes. You always kind of run this risk. I mean, Inchgower, nice kind of light, sort of grassy, citric, Speyside whiskey. It's going to get swamped so easily. But I can get the Inchgower character. There is a grassiness there. There's a citricness. There's a minerality. It's actually a lovely nose, and it has to be said. I am getting a tingling in the nether regions. Ooh. It's aromatic. It's kind of full. It's big, Sauternes, and it's honeyed, but it's grounded because it has that minerality, that freshness, that grassiness, and it's that sort of like, oh my God, I can get the Inchgower character. I was not expecting that. It was completely. It's kind of a bit of a sideways thing, isn't it? I suppose. Yeah, that's what the pass on. Oh, that's masked. Oh, that's got some. What is it? 57.1. Yeah, that bloody well tastes like it. Again, quite full, quite rich. It kind of kicks off with all the Sauternes kind of character, the honey, the sort of marmalade, the sort of late harvested fruit. I don't know whether I'm getting the Inchgower character on the finish. It is very kind of alcoholic, and that is kind of emphasising the minerality and the citrus. And it's really making my mouth water, and I don't know whether that is character or whether it's just purely alcohol. The key is going to be when you put a little drop of water with it, because that will basically negate the alcohol to a certain extent, and that will basically sort of let you know whether the finish is really crisp and minerally and fresh and citric, or whether the finish was just bloody well alcohol. So we'll kind of have a look and see. I mean, it's still very similar to as it was neat with the nose. Aromatic white fruits, honey, a little bit of marmalade. Again, it's possibly emphasised the Sauternes a little bit more now you put a little bit of water with it. And this is the thing, when you put a little drop of water with whiskey, certainly sometimes it will emphasise the oak, sometimes it won't, and you just have absolutely no idea. It's a bit of a kind of like a, well, you know, you put a little drop of water and you see what happens. Anyway, let's see what comes up. Softer, the citrus, and it's still there. It is there. It's not. It wasn't alcohol. It was citrus. It was minerality. It's a lot nicer balance now. Yes, there's still plenty of honey. There's still plenty of richness. There's plenty of Sauternes character, but it kind of like kicks off with that, and it just peters out to let the sort of spirit come through on the finish, and I'm getting that sort of slight grassiness, that citric character, a little bit of barley, minerality. That is kind of lovely because it's unexpected. It's sort of like you taste it and you kind of almost to a certain extent are expecting the Sauternes character to sort of overwhelm the sort of, you know, delicate Inchgower character. And then it turns out to be completely nothing like you would imagined. But no, that's all right. It doesn't quite it's not hampered by the cask. It's more balanced than that. And in actual fact, you put a little drop of water with it, and it kind of all really kind of nuances out. And I really kind of quite like that. I think that's a superb whiskey. Right, okay, so let's sum today's episode of the show. Firstly, a big thank you to Brave New Spirits and to Mossburn for the samples for today's episode of the show. Right, okay, so let's sum today's episode of the show. Firstly, a big thank you to Mossburn and to Brave New Spirits for the samples for today's episode of the show. The continued support of you guys is very much appreciated. You know, I guess by now that most of the independent bottling companies that I deal with fairly regularly are kind of expecting the usual. When they send me an email saying we've got a load of new releases, they're expecting the can you send me some samples email. And you know, it's kind of, you know, it's all part of the game at the end of the day. And you know, I'm going to sort of, you know, support the independent bottling companies because obviously I'm a big fan of what they do. But like I said, you know, not everything is just absolutely rosy, and I won't buy it if I don't think it kind of, you know, hits the bar, so to speak. Anyway, so the Mossburn North British, and I suppose you could kind of almost say the same with the Brave New Spirits grain whiskey, is that yes, the grain whiskey kind of like came through in both of them, the Oloroso and the wine casks, and it kind of, that they had balance. They were not the most complex whiskies on the face of the planet. They were okay, and again, at the end of the day, it would all come down to basically what you would have to retail them for, and were they worth that kind of retail price at the end of the day. And that, a lot of the time, that's just kind of like the big conundrum. It's not necessarily, I mean, yes, you do kind of like I said, you taste whiskey, and more often than not, I tend to taste them without actually knowing what the cost prices are, because I don't want that to be an influence initially on my tastings. I want to purely taste the spirit and sort of make up my opinion based on the quality or lack thereof, shall we say, of the spirit itself. Then I will have a look at what I would have to retail it for, and then I will kind of like decide whether I think it's worth it or not. So yeah, it's that all boils down to that kind of thing. The Blair Athol, the Ivy in Tennessee, yeah, that was a good bottling, it has to be said. Blair Athol is one of those kind of whiskies that you do see an awful lot in the independent lists, but it kind of like is a whiskey that kind of works with pretty much most things. You can chuck an entire bloody forest at it, as far as I'm concerned, and it will probably cope with it. It's a spirit that's got cojones. It will deal with stuff. And yeah, I thought that was not a bad bottling at all. The Craigellachie, the sort of Cote de Rhone matured, that was just all about the cask at the end of the day, and there was no real Craigellachie character. The Mossburn Craigellachie at least showcased some Craigellachie, some meaty Craigellachie, and was actually not too bad at all. I kind of dismissed that early on when I tasted it first time, and it was, maybe I was a bit hasty, but again, it's a style of whiskey you have to really like. You know, you have to like sort of, you know, Dalwhinnie and sort of other spirits of that kind of similar production style. But you know what, I will give it its dues. Technically it was a very, very good bottling. And the Inchgower, like I said, that really I thought was an exceptionally good whiskey. It was one of those kind of whiskies that you taste that you don't, and I don't taste whiskey with a preconception, but when you look at things on paper and you think, yeah, okay, an Inchgower Sauternes, is that going to be swamped by it? You don't let your kind of like that kind of thought overwhelm what you're tasting, but it is a thought, and sometimes that you're proved right in those kind of thoughts, and sometimes you're proved wrong. And in this instance, it really worked quite nicely. The sweetness worked in quite nicely with the sort of almost slightly acerbic, citric, and sort of grassy, green, Speyside character. Put a little drop of water with it, and it all kind of like sort of, you know, melded out quite nicely, and it was really quite an enjoyable whiskey at the end of the day. So yeah, that's this week's episode of the show in the bag. I hope you've enjoyed it. I think it's been sort of a great deal of fun. Always nice to sort of look at some new stuff and review them, so that you guys can go and kind of buy them if you think that they're the sort of whiskey that is for you. So I hope you do. You know, there's not a lot of whiskey left, so I'm stuck with a bit of Telford. Until next time, good afternoon and good dramming.